So does this sound familiar to you? You're working on a project right now. You're probably using one of these AI coding tools. It might be Cursor agents. And while you're able to get some of the early work done with the agent, when it comes to the complex backend, hooking up the database, doing auth work, things seem to not work as well. Now, is this on the agents? Is it on the model? Is it your code structure? That's kind of what I'm going to break down in this video for you. But first, let's back up a bit and talk about what are these cursor agents? This is just a way to do automated context mapping. If you've used Cursor in the past with Composer and the chat feature, you know that you can basically add any file and manually stitch together a context. What automated context mapping here does is eliminates the need to do that manual stitching. It helps folks who are maybe not as familiar with the domain they're using, and it does a little bit of the heavy lifting for them. Now, there is some magic underneath the hood here that the Cursor team is doing. They've also kind of lifted this feature from another IDE called Windsurf, and I haven't done a ton of comparisons between the two, but from what I've seen, it kind of functions pretty much the same. Now, this is really about user accessibility because the composer feature versus the chat feature versus the agent feature are kind of all the same. There are a couple of extra niceties with the agent, but there are a few things that are missing as well. I'm going to go through in a bit. What you really need to think about is like, what are the performance variables I care about? If you have a very simple, organized code base, the agent might just be able to rip through it. As your code base gets really large, more complex, if it's a really risky part of your code base, you might not rely on the performance of this agent to get that job done for you. And you also have to consider the limitations of the current gen of models. You need to stuff the entire code base in these contexts sometimes just so you can get a good answer. If the agent isn't picking up on the correct context, maybe your files aren't named correctly, maybe the structure is not something that it's used to, then it's going to struggle to actually stitch that context together. With the agent feature, it's more opaque. You're not going to see what context it's picking up initially, but with chat and composer, you can see the context. You can do more of that work yourself. So there's a trade-off there. And then there's a big dependency on structure. If you don't set up your code base in the right way before using these agents, what can happen is it just actually starts deleting directories of code, or it'll start replacing entire files if you're not very specific about where it should make these edits. So overall, cursor agents are pretty much an automated way to make updates to your code base. What are the quick pros and cons for you to watch out for when it comes to cursor agents? I think real big positive is suggested terminal commands. The only gotcha is if you have a preferred package manager or a preferred library that you'd like to use at the terminal, it's not going to know that. It's just going to go with like the most commonly used packages and package managers. So for me, an example would be npm versus yarn. Some people like bun, and I think there's a 50 others, but I tend to like yarn. So it'll always recommend npm, maybe sometimes npx. So I tend to just tell it, hey, use yarn instead. And from there on, it uses yarn. It seems to remember that. And then the automated context handling is actually, I think, pretty good. Now, the expectation is that you don't have to do any context management. I think that's wrong. You probably do need to reference like a file or two, but compared to chat and the original composer feature, you need to add in much less context. It picks up on a lot of it. I tend to see when you don't add any context at all, that's when it performs the worst. A couple of disadvantages is one, there's no folder reference. Maybe that's something that's coming in the future. I don't know if it's a bug in my installation, but I don't see any folder referencing for the agents. And it does have this tendency to get stuck. So it'll just like keep spinning and spinning and spinning. I'll have to manually cancel it, try it again. It's even gotten stuck after once or two times. So I chalk that up to this just being an early feature. And I've been an early cursor user, so I've been through like a lot of bugs with this. So I'm not surprised there's a couple bugs in this initial launch. All right, so here is another question that I see often, and it was a good suggestion, was like, how much coding should I know? And that really doesn't depend. I don't like that answer. You should know a little bit of coding. AI tools have done a great job of democratizing the process, the syntax, the generation of it, but you cannot outsource your thinking to the model. So you should have some basic knowledge if you're going to build a SaaS application. This is like if you showed up to a soccer game and didn't know the rules of the soccer game. Learn the basic rules before you get on the field is pretty much kind of my advice here. So understanding design patterns, understanding the architecture principles, kind of still remain essential, especially as you start to move away from the front end towards the back end. And then there's is complexity. So if you don't know how to code, you probably can get some early wins. But as you start to get into the back end, and as things get more complex, there's more integration work to do. Either you're gonna have to depend on whatever platform that you're using, or depend on the agent. But at some point, the agent's gonna fail. You need to kind of jump in there and start coding it yourself. The context matters here, right? Are you an enterprise? Are you using this for enterprise work? Are you using this for startup work? Are you using it for a personal app? So if you're using it for a personal app, I don't think it matters. Like, just have fun, use the tool. It's a fun tool to use. If you're doing a startup, there's less compliance and audit requirements probably. Once you're in enterprise land, like, things are serious, right? You need to have audit trails. You need to comply with federal requirements. Overall, it's not really about how much coding you should know. Just take a strategic approach to this. Learn some of the fundamentals, learn some of the basics, but then just do just in time learning. That way, you're not stuck when something happens. Also, you can just practice with the AI in terms of having it explain what it just did. So, when you ask the AI to do something for you, and you ask these agents to get some of the work done for you, ask it to explain what it just did, maybe draw a little ASCII architecture diagram. That's always good to catch you up or close any gaps you have. An example would be for me on front end development. I'm not that great. I really rely on cursor agents to do a lot of my front end development work. It's worked out well for me so far. But I also ask it to, hey, like, explain to me how this component works. Explain to me how, this context is using this hook or whatever it is. The next question: when should you use cursor AI agents? You should have a little bit of coding knowledge. You kind of know the pros and cons, but when should you actually use it? And they're really effective in certain places and they're not effective in others. And they tend to really, really struggle. I call this the 80-20 problem. AI agents tend to, like, really excel at, like, the first 80%. And anyone who does software for a living or maybe has done some work as an engineer will tell you that first 80%, you can fly through that in maybe a day or two. That last 20% might take you the next 3 months to actually finish because it's all about the integrations, it's all about the optimizations. And then there's this component of quality control. So if you're in a spot where you need a lot of quality control and you want to give it over to an agent, that tends to be a bad mix because agents tend to go towards a brute forcey approach. If you're looking to get a lot of performance out of something, or if you're looking to make it really, really secure, I wouldn't rely on the agent to get that done for you. Even outside of Cursor, outside of any tool, it's just in general. It's really based on the use case that you have in front of you. Personal projects, prototypes, great. But I think for, like, real commercial grade applications, you're about to charge customers, even if you have Cursor AI agents do a lot of the work for you, be sure to take a look at it, have someone review it. And you're probably never going to get away from integration challenges. I believe that most of these platforms are going to start to integrate a lot of these common vendor tools like Stripe, and maybe some of the database providers are probably going to get bundled in to the other tools. I don't see that happening for Cursor, but most people using Cursor, if you're using it right now, you probably do know how to integrate Stripe. You probably do know how to do your own auth. And it really depends on where you are on this line here. And I like to call this the complexity line. And we've kind of covered this idea a bit, but let's make it more concrete. If you are building something like a static landing page, it tends to be lower on the complexity line. There's not a lot of moving pieces here. If you're building something like a long running batch processing job that's using multiple models that you've developed, this tends to be on the higher end of the complexity line. And the problem I call the prompt gap. So at certain points, everything's going great. You're working on your project, you're getting things done, you're prompt this, prompt that. And then you hit this weird, like, messy middle gap place here where some of your prompts start to work, some of them don't. You're running into errors. You're starting to see a lot of errors, some stack traces you don't understand. This is probably where you're taking a screenshot of the error, popping it back into the AI, and then kind of letting it work from there. Now, once you get to that point, at some point you hit this wall where, that's no longer working either. So you have to take a look at the code. And as you start to take a look at the code, you realize it's messy. You're not sure where to make edits. The agent starts veering off out of control. And that's where you hit this kind of dead zone here where no matter how much prompting you do, no matter how much context mapping you do, you've pushed the code base to a point where it's no longer feasible to extend it. Now, a practical example here would be, let's say you're building an app that has to go out and hit the official YouTube data API. There's no amount of prompting that you're going to be able to do that it hits this API, because at some point you need to, one, provide the API key, and then two, you also need to reach out to YouTube and get approval. Say you're using some restricted scopes, you have to get approval from them. So there's no way the agent will do that, at least as of today, to get that all done for you. You know there's a complexity line. You understand that at some point you have to do some type of manual intervention with the agents. But can you start to use these agents, cursor agents specifically, to build entire apps? The promise of cursor agents is that it helps you with that early development, but it also should be able to handle that backend. I think it can help a lot, but it's not going to do all of it for you. It's going to come down to your approach. Maybe you can shoot from the hip and get it to build you an entire application, but that's going to be very difficult. I like to use something I call the three repository approach, where I separate it into a landing page, a dashboard, and a backend API. That way, whatever agent I'm using has enough context, but it doesn't bleed into the other spots where it might actually do some harm. So overall, architecture matters more here as you start to use cursor agents. This three repo approach helps you separate your concerns. If you know you're using the agent on your landing page only inside of that repo, there's no concern that it'll just randomly delete your API. Even if it deletes that entire code base of code, your API is fine. There's also this advantage when on the front end with building out these SaaS applications. If you isolate things into their own separate repos and you let the agent loose there, you can basically just throw it a screenshot of something and it will build it out. And you can ask it to kind of stub out the different API endpoints, stub out the data model for you, instead of trying to update the API, update the dashboard, and also update your landing page all inside of the same repo. But with these agents, especially if you're building out a SaaS product, there's going to be some backend risk, right? Code is an asset in this case. And so if you're just kind of letting the agent rip on the backend, it might delete a whole swath of code. You can recover it with Git, but that's a terrible workflow to have. So being very careful and strategic on the back end is more important than having all the code generated. I tend to, once I switch over to more back end development work, I tend to use chat more often than I use the cursor agent realistically. I actually rarely use Composer these days. I'm pretty much either chat or I'm going directly to the agent to just kind of let it go. And there's also this testing requirement too. So if you're on the back end, you shouldn't really just let the agent make a ton of changes to your code without some formal test in place. Now, I'm not saying go crazy with like extensive TDD where you need hundreds and hundreds of tests. Like you're building something to figure out if it's a good fit or not, or maybe you're building a smaller MVP and you just don't need that much testing. Testing should be a byproduct of how much confidence you have in the system. So if you have a lot of confidence, I don't think you need that many tests. But because you shouldn't have a lot of confidence in this agent making a ton of changes to your backend, have some tests that if you run it, you can see over time, oops, it kind of broke something. Like, let's go investigate what it broke. So let's try to visualize this. And I already talked a little bit about the prompt gap, and I want to zoom in on it and make it a little bit more practical for you. Let's give it a new name. Let's call it the day two prompt gap. And this will make it a little bit more concrete. So on the first day, it's mostly boilerplate setup that you're doing. And this tends to go very well, right? You generate your front end and you might generate some orchestration code. Now, the orchestrator is not something most of these generation tools are doing. It's kind of a thing I do with my front ends and the work I have on my back end in my entire process. And I found that this is the easier part to get done. Now, where things start to get tricky is when you start leaving this front end, so all these day one setup and these operations, and you start moving into setting up your services. And these services will interact with things like billing, auth, your database, and beyond just like the initial get it connected, get it set up. This is where your business logic has to interact. Maybe you need to charge customers. How are you handling item potency? How are you handling adding users to your database? Do you have a wait list? How are you getting them off the wait list? How are you updating their claims on their JWT token? All these really nitty-gritty technical details that have to get taken care of tend to fall into the day two operation. So these are things you're not worried about at initial setup, but now you're worried about because you actually have to deliver on some functionality. And this is the gap that occurs here. And through this gap, it is helpful to have that chat. that chat with you because the chat can kind of help you through some of the design decisions as well. I don't tend to use the composer agent in this spot because I need more control over what's exactly happening. So I'll go directly into a file, maybe do like a command K edit right there. And as I tend to move towards more of setting up the billing and the database and the auth stuff, especially around the database, those are tend to be more manual changes unless I'm writing like a quick query or something. And I tend to not use Composer Agent to say, hey, make an entire change to my code base here because any any subtle bugs or any issues here causes major problems down the line. When I first started using Composer Agents, it did make some subtle changes to one of my code bases that I didn't realize until much later, and I took a whole afternoon to try to debug it. Now, have I done that to myself without using an agent? Absolutely. So the probability of that happening just goes up. So you just be aware of the risk. So overall, agents are not a silver bullet. This is not something that's just going to magically code everything for you, and nor should it. I think you need to come into it with some realistic expectations. I don't want to overhype it for you, but at the same time, I think there's some really good positives here. There's things like the automated context mapping that you don't have to stitch together so much of these files anymore. You can kind of let the agent go. And I think for front end development, this is really impressive that at this point, you can basically just give a screenshot to this agent and it will build out a front end for you. And it's really up to you to set up the styling and the rest of the stuff, but the structure is there and you can get a lot of people started pretty quickly. You know, most apps in the world are either a static page or a CRUD app. So a lot of that can be automated now by these coding agents. And I'm actually looking forward to when a lot of them are more integrated on the billing, auth, and data space side as well.